The millionaire didn't see the 5-year-old boy as a threat. Not until the child stepped between him and the cleaning woman, raised a tiny fist and said, "You don't talk to my mom like that." In that frozen second, in a mansion office worth millions, a single act of childish courage unraveled a lifetime of power, exposing a hidden world of exploitation and the profound cost of a mother's silent sacrifice. This is Leo. His mother, Maria, cleaned the mansion's floors to keep a roof over their heads. The man in the suit is Alexander Vance, a tech investor who built his fortune on ruthless deals. In that moment, a child's simple sense of justice would tear open a hidden ledger of cruelty, exposing a truth Vance had paid millions to bury. But to understand why a 5-year-old became his mother's only defender, you have to go back to the beginning, to the day Maria walked through those doors, and to the invisible contract of silence she was forced to sign. Maria took the cleaning job at the Vance estate because the agency promised discretion and a living wage. What they didn't mention was that Alexander Vance's definition of discretion meant invisibility. Her first day was a tutorial in silence. Don't make eye contact, don't speak unless spoken to, clean around him as if you're not there. The rules were delivered by the stone-faced house manager, a woman named Clara, who handed Maria a uniform 2 sizes too large and a bucket of harsh, lemon-scented chemicals that burned her nostrils. The pay was $19 an hour, cash, no contract, no benefits. For Maria, a single mother whose immigration status was a tangle of pending papers and expired visas, it was the only offer on the table. She had Leo to feed. Silence was a price she agreed to pay. Alexander Vance's world was built on a different kind of calculation. At 42, he was the founder of Axiom Data Solutions, a firm that specialized in acquiring failing companies, stripping their assets, and selling the bones for profit. His net worth was estimated at $300 million. His reputation was cold precision. He lived alone in the 12,000-square-foot modern mansion in Pacific Heights, a glass and steel monument to winning. Every surface was polished. Every object had a place. Disorder to Vance was not just messiness, it was a personal insult, a flaw in the system. For the first few months, the system worked. Maria arrived at 6 a.m., entered through the service entrance and cleaned the lower floors, the gym, the cinema room, the garage, while Vance was still asleep. By 9, she was gone, having never seen her employer. Leo stayed with a neighbor, an elderly woman who watched him for $40 a day. Maria's entire paycheck flowed out in a loop: rent, childcare, groceries, bus fare. She was surviving, but just barely. The silence was heavy, but it was safe. Then Vance's schedule changed. A major deal was collapsing. A competitor named Tech Vertex was outmaneuvering him. The pressure turned his home into a war room. He started working from the mansion, holding tense calls in his study at all hours. Maria's invisibility began to fracture. She'd be polishing the study floor when he'd burst in, barking into his phone. "I don't care what the lawyers say, sink them. Make the liabilities so high they can't breathe." He'd pace, oblivious to her crouched form by the bookshelf. She learned to make herself smaller, to become part of the wall. The first humiliation was small, almost casual. Maria was cleaning the glass dining table. Vance was at the head, scrolling through reports. Without looking up, he snapped his fingers. "You streak on the left side." Maria moved to reclean it. "Not with that cloth, it's clearly dirty. Are you blind?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp as a scalpel. Heat rushed to her face. She fetched a new cloth, her hands trembling slightly. He never glanced up from his tablet. The message was clear. She was not a person. She was a function, and currently a malfunctioning one. Things escalated with the arrival of Mason Crow, Vance's fixer. Where Vance was cold and polished, Crow was raw menace in an expensive suit. He handled the undesirable elements of Vance's deals, intimidating whistleblowers, pressuring zoning officials, ensuring silence. Crow began appearing at the house for meetings. He noticed Maria. His eyes would follow her as she vacuumed, a slow, appraising look that made her skin crawl. One afternoon, as she emptied wastebaskets in the study, Crow was leaning against Vance's desk. "You trust her?" Crow asked, jerking his thumb toward Maria. Vance didn't even look over. "She doesn't speak English." It was a lie and a test. Maria kept her head down, pretending not to understand. Crow laughed. "Cheaper that way." The real turning point began with a piece of paper. It was a Thursday. Vance and Crow had been in a shouting match in the study. When they stormed out, Maria moved in to clean. In the wastebasket, among crumpled printouts, was a single torn half-sheet of notepaper. The handwritten scrawl was urgent, angry. It listed a name, David Reyes, an address in the Mission District, and 2 words, "Handle it, quietly." Below it was a sticky note with a different handwriting, likely Clara's, reminding Vance about a compliance interview with DOL, the Department of Labor, scheduled for the following Tuesday. Maria's blood ran cold. David Reyes was her cousin. He worked in warehouse logistics. He had called her just 2 nights before, nervous, saying his friends at a Tech Vertex packaging plant were being questioned by some rough-looking men about unionizing efforts. He asked if her fancy boss was involved. She told him no, to stay out of it. Now this note, handle it. She knew what that meant when Mason Crowe was involved. She made a choice, a terrible, dangerous choice. She didn't throw the note away. She smoothed it out and hid it in the inner pocket of her oversized uniform. It was evidence of what she wasn't sure, but it felt like a thread she could pull if she needed to. A piece of leverage in a world where she had none. It was her first step out of silence, and she didn't know it was a step off a cliff. That weekend, the atmosphere curdled. Vance's deal with Tech Vertex was disintegrating publicly. News sites ran headlines questioning his tactics. The Department of Labor interview loomed. The mansion felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Vance's criticisms of Maria's work became constant, irrational. A single water spot on a faucet was incompetence. The pattern on the rug wasn't vacuumed perfectly straight. "Do you have any standards?" he'd seethe. Clara, the manager, offered no protection. She just nodded along, adding, "You need to be more detail-oriented, Maria." On Monday, the day before the DOL interview, the trap was set. Clara informed Maria that due to special preparations, she needed to clean Vance's private upstairs office, a space always off-limits during his lunch meeting downstairs. "Do not touch the desk, only dust and vacuum. Be in and out in 20 minutes, Clara instructed, her eyes avoiding Maria. The office was a minimalist cage of power. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a vast empty desk, a single abstract painting worth more than Maria would earn in a lifetime. She dusted quickly, her heart pounding. As she vacuumed near the desk, her foot caught the edge of a low drawer that was slightly ajar. It slid open another inch. Inside, not tucked away but lying loose, was a familiar-looking file. Tabbed on the side was the name Reyes D, and next to it, Compliance DOL interview script. A script for a government interview. Maria's hands went numb. She heard voices approaching down the hall. Panicked, she shut the drawer with her knee and swung the vacuum away just as the door opened. It was Vance. It was Mason Crowe. He stood in the doorway, not entering, just watching her. A slow, thin smile spread across his face. "Find everything you need, Maria?" he asked, his voice oily and calm. She stammered, "Yes, just finishing." "Good," Crowe said, his eyes locked on hers. "Mr. Vance has been wondering about some missing paperwork. You haven't seen any loose notes around, have you? Trash can maybe." He knew she had the note. This wasn't about cleaning. This was an audit, and she had just failed. "Get downstairs," Crowe said, the smile vanishing. "Mr. Vance wants to see you in the study. Now." Maria's mind raced. The hidden note burned in her pocket. The file in the drawer screamed a setup. She was being summoned not for a scolding, but for an execution. And as she walked past Crowe, he leaned in, his breath hot on her ear, and whispered the words that sealed the nightmare. "He knows about your boy too, cute kid, Leo, right?" Maria stopped breathing. The world tunneled. The invisible contract was broken. The silence was over. And as she descended the grand staircase toward the study, toward Alexander Vance's waiting fury, she realized the only thing left to protect was standing in the service entrance hallway, clutching a toy car, wondering where his mommy was. Leo had followed the neighbor to drop off a forgotten lunchbox, and he was about to walk into the heart of the storm. Leo didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the sharp, ugly sound of a man yelling at his mother. He'd been waiting by the service door, clutching his toy car, when the raised voices pulled him down the hall. He peeked around the study's open doorway. His mother stood very still, head bowed in front of the giant glass desk. The man in the suit, Vance, was standing over her, his finger jabbing the air. Another man, Crowe, leaned against the bookshelf, smiling a mean smile. Clara, the manager, was by the window, looking at the floor. Leo saw his mother's shoulders shaking. He saw the tear that traced a line through the dust on her cheek, and something hot and fierce rose up in his 5-year-old chest. He didn't think, he just walked into the room. The sound of his small sneakers on the hardwood floor made Vance stop mid-sentence. Everyone turned. Maria's eyes went wide with terror. "Leo, no, go wait outside," she whispered, her voice cracking. But Leo walked right up to Vance, his head tilting back to look at the giant man. He raised his tiny fist, not to hit, but to point, his whole body trembling with the effort. "You don't talk to my mom like that," he said, his voice clear and high in the silent room. "You're being a bad man." For a long second, no one moved. Vance's face cycled through emotions, shock, irritation, and then a cold, chilling amusement. He looked from the boy to Maria, then back again. "A bad man," Vance repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. He crouched down, bringing himself to Leo's eye level. "And what do bad men deserve, little man?" Leo didn't flinch. "They get time out." A hollow laugh escaped Crow. Vance just stared, and in that stare, Maria saw the gears turning. He wasn't angry at the interruption. He was calculating. Vance stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Maria. "Take your son and get out of my house," he said, each word precise and frozen. "You're fired, and if I ever see either of you near my property again, I will call immigration so fast your head will spin." Maria's legs almost buckled. She stumbled forward, grabbing Leo and pulling him into her chest. "Please, Mr. Vance, he's just a child," he didn't. "Get out," Vance roared, the controls snapping. Maria flinched, shielding Leo with her body. She turned and hurried from the room, half dragging Leo, feeling the burn of 3 pairs of eyes on her back. As she fled down the hallway, she heard Crow's voice, low and mocking. "Kids got a pair, pity." Outside in the cold afternoon air, the reality crashed down. No job, no paycheck in 2 days, rent due in a week, and Vance's threat hung over her like a blade. She called her cousin, David Reyes, voice shaking so hard she could barely speak. He told her to come straight to his apartment in the Mission. "Do not go home," he said, a new fear in his own voice. At David's cramped apartment, the pieces began to fit together into a terrifying picture. David showed her his phone, messages from unknown numbers. "Stop asking questions at the plant. Remember your family." He'd been trying to organize workers at the Tech Vertex packaging plant, which was a key supplier in the deal Vance was trying to salvage. Vance's competitor, Tech Vertex, was actually supportive of the union effort. It made their operation more stable, more attractive to investors. Vance needed the deal to fail, so he needed the union effort to fail. He needed David silenced. Maria, her hands trembling, pulled the crumpled note from her uniform pocket. "Handle it, quietly." David's face went pale. "Where did you get this?" She told him about the wastebasket, about the file in the drawer labeled with his name and DOL interview script. David sank into a chair. "They're not just trying to scare me off. They're scripting the whole government interview. They're going to lie. They're going to say I'm a disgruntled employee making threats. They're building a file to discredit me before I can even speak." Then David revealed the second, worse layer. He'd done some digging of his own after the threats started. Through a friend at a private security firm, he'd accessed a license plate that had been following him. It traced back to a shell company, which traced back to a law firm, which was on retainer for Axiom Data Solutions. But the trail didn't stop there. The shell company had also recently paid for surveillance on another address. David pulled up a grainy, time-stamped photo on his laptop. It was Maria's apartment building, and another, taken just 3 days ago, of Leo playing in the shared courtyard. Maria felt the world drop out from under her. Crow's whisper in her ear, "He knows about your boy," wasn't just a threat. It was a statement of fact. They had been watching. They knew her vulnerabilities. The fired cleaning woman was now a liability with a grudge and a piece of evidence, and her son was a point of maximum pressure. Back at the Vance estate, the machinery was moving. Clara, under orders, was meticulously fabricating a personnel file for Maria. False write-ups for insubordination, complaints about stolen household items, a note alleging erratic behavior in front of guests. It was a preemptive strike designed to destroy Maria's credibility if she ever spoke up. Meanwhile, Crow was on the phone with a contact at the Department of Labor, smoothly suggesting they might want to look into a former employee with an axe to grind and immigration issues, who was conspiring with a known agitator, David Reyes, to smear a reputable businessman. Vance, however, was preoccupied. The confrontation with the boy had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't articulate. He stood at his pristine window, watching the city lights wink on. The child's words echoed, "Bad man." He was a man who dealt in numbers, in logic, in winning. Morality was a variable, not a constant, but the absolute black and white judgment in a child's eyes, it was an irrational data point. It offended his sense of control. He ordered Crow to accelerate the pressure on David Reyes. "I want him broken and silent by tomorrow. Use whatever leverage you have." Crow knew exactly what that meant. That night, two men in dark hoodies smashed the windows of David's car, which was parked outside his apartment. They left a note on the dashboard, a printed photo of Maria and Leo leaving the Vance mansion that afternoon. On the back, a single word, "Last warning." Panic set in. David wanted to go to the police, but Maria was paralyzed by fear of deportation. "They have pictures of Leo. They know where we live. Vance has lawyers. The police will believe him." They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, holding a note that was now more dangerous than valuable. But then a crack appeared. A name from Maria's past surfaced. Years ago, before Leo, she had worked as a hotel housekeeper. One of the regular guests was an elderly labor rights attorney named Arthur Finch. He'd always been kind, had left her generous tips and books in Spanish for her to practice English. She'd heard he was retired now, but he was a legend in local advocacy circles. With nothing left to lose, Maria found his number in an old online directory. She called, expecting a voicemail. He answered on the second ring. She spilled the story in a frantic, tearful jumble, the note, the file, the threats, the photo of her son. Arthur Finch listened in silence. When she finished, he let out a long, slow breath. "Maria," he said, his voice gravelly but steady, "do not throw that note away. Do not talk to anyone else. Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the cafe on the corner of 9th and Bryant. Bring the note. And Maria, you've just stepped on a dragon's tail. It's going to try to burn you." But dragons have a weakness. They never expect the little people to fight back with their own fire. For the first time since she walked into the mansion, Maria felt a flicker of something other than terror. It was a thin, fragile thread of hope. She told David, who was skeptical but desperate. They made a plan to meet Finch together. They didn't know that their every move was still being watched. Crow's surveillance team reported the call to an unknown number, traced to a landline registered to Arthur Finch. When Crow heard the name, he didn't smile. He went very still. Arthur Finch wasn't just any retired lawyer. He was the man who 20 years prior had successfully prosecuted Crow's own father for racketeering, sending him to prison for 15 years. This wasn't just a problem anymore. It was personal. Crow didn't go to Vance with this information. He saw an opportunity. He could handle the Finch problem himself in a way that would tie up all the loose ends permanently. He put a new plan into motion, one that didn't just aim to silence Maria and David, but to bury them. He reached out to a different, darker contact, one that specialized in making problems disappear, not through threats, but through tragic, believable accidents. The next morning, Maria and David walked toward the cafe on 9th and Bryant, the folded note a secret, burning weight in Maria's purse. Leo was with a different, trusted friend. They were 2 blocks away when a black sedan with tinted windows slowly pulled into the intersection ahead of them and stopped, idling. The driver's side door opened, and Mason Crow stepped out. He wasn't smiling. He leaned against the car, blocking the sidewalk, and waited for them to reach him. He held up his phone, showing a live feed. It was the friend's apartment building where Leo was staying. The camera zoomed in on a window. On the other side of the glass, they could see the back of Leo's head as he played with blocks. "Good morning," Crow said, his voice flat. "We need to have a different conversation. Get in the car, or the next person to visit that apartment won't be so friendly." Maria's blood turned to ice. The live feed of Leo wasn't a bluff, it was a collar. She looked at David, whose face was a mask of furious helplessness. They had no choice. They got into the back of the black sedan. Crow slid into the driver's seat, the doors locking with a soft, definitive click. He didn't speak as he pulled away from the curb, weaving through downtown traffic. Maria's hand closed around the note in her purse like it was a holy relic. "Where are you taking us?" David demanded. "To see a friend of yours," Crow said, his eyes meeting David's in the rearview mirror. "Arthur Finch, you had a 10 a.m. meeting. It's 9:45. We're going to be fashionably early." Maria's fragile hope shattered. They knew everything. The call, the meeting place, the time. Crow continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. Finch is a sentimental old man. He likes to think he's a white knight. But knights get unhorsed, Mr. Rays. They get trampled. My father learned that lesson the hard way thanks to him, so this isn't just business anymore. This is a family matter. He drove them not to the cafe, but to a sterile, anonymous office building in the financial district. A private security firm leased the top 2 floors. Crow marched them through a marble lobby, past a receptionist who didn't look up, and into a windowless conference room. On the table sat a single manila folder and a digital voice recorder. Sit, Crow instructed. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Maria cleaning the Vance study, David handing out flyers at the Tech Vertex plant, Arthur Finch leaving his retirement community, and more of Leo at the park at the bus stop. Here's what's going to happen, Crow said, pressing record on the device. You, Maria, are going to state your full name, and then you are going to say that you stole a confidential document from Mr. Vance's home. That you conspired with your cousin, David Rays, to fabricate accusations of wrongdoing for financial gain. You will say Arthur Finch put you up to it, promising you legal status in exchange for lying. Maria stared, mute with horror. David slammed his hands on the table. We're not saying a word. This is coercion. Crow didn't raise his voice. He picked up a photograph of Leo looking up at the camera, a small, unknowing smile on his face. You will, he said softly, because if you don't, your son goes into the system. Foster care, you, Maria, get deported before sunset. And David here, Crow slid another photo forward. It was David's elderly mother, watering plants on her porch in Modesto. Well, let's just say retirement communities aren't as safe as they used to be. It was a checkmate constructed of pure terror. The recorder hummed softly on the table. Crow leaned back, waiting. The silence stretched, suffocating. Maria looked at the picture of her son. She thought of the cold, impersonal machinery of the state that would swallow him. She opened her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. But before she could speak, the door to the conference room burst open. It wasn't security. It was Arthur Finch, flanked by 2 serious-looking men in suits. He was older, frailer than Maria remembered, but his eyes were sharp, burning with a cold fire. The meeting was at the Café Mason, Finch said, his voice filling the room. But I had a feeling you'd try to change the venue. Crow shot to his feet, his cool facade cracking into raw anger. You have no jurisdiction here, old man. This is a private mediation. Mediation, Finch barked a laugh. He pointed to the recorder. That's evidence of attempted witness tampering and extortion. And these gentlemen, he gestured to the suits beside him, are from the State Attorney General's office. They've been enjoying the audio feed from Maria's purse for the last 20 minutes. Maria looked down, confused. One of the suits, a woman with a stern expression, gave a slight nod. The emergency beacon, Maria, in the lining, you activated it when you got in the car. It was a precaution Mr. Finch arranged after your call. Crow's face went from red to white. He lunged for the recorder, but one of the state agents was faster, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back. Mason Crow, you are under arrest for attempted extortion, coercion, and making criminal threats. You have the right to remain silent. The words were clinical, final. As Crow was handcuffed, sputtering threats that dissolved into legal jargon, Finch hurried to Maria and David. Are you both all right? Did they hurt you? Maria could only shake her head, tears of relief and shock streaming down her face. She handed him the crumpled note from her purse. His eyes scanned it, and a grim smile touched his lips. This is the thread, he whispered. This is how we pull the whole tapestry apart. But the victory was short-lived. One of the state agents took Finch aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Finch's expression darkened. He returned to Maria and David. Crow was a snake, but he wasn't the head. Vance is insulated. He'll claim Crow acted alone, a rogue employee. He'll throw him to the wolves. And without direct, incontrovertible proof linking Vance to the threats, to the scripted interview, he walks away. The note is a start, but it's not enough. We need the file from his desk, the one labeled DOL interview script. David's shoulders slumped. It's in his office, in a locked drawer. We can't just walk in there. Finch's eyes gleamed. No, you can't, but the Department of Labor can. Their interview with Vance is still scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. at his office. If they had probable cause to look for that specific file during their visit, he let the idea hang in the air. It was a dangerous gamble. They had to get the information to the DOL investigator before the interview without Vance finding out and destroying the evidence. And they had to do it in less than 24 hours, while Vance was now on highest alert, knowing Crow had been arrested. Back at his mansion, Alexander Vance received the news of Crow's arrest via terse call from his head of security. He didn't rage. He sat perfectly still in his study, the same place Leo had confronted him. His mind was a supercomputer assessing damage. Crow was a liability, but a contained one. He would not talk. His loyalty was bought with money and a shared history of dirt. The immediate threat was the DOL interview. He had the scripted file, yes, but its existence was now a vulnerability. He needed to shred it, but doing so hastily could be seen as destruction of evidence if anyone came looking. He decided on a different tactic: misdirection. He would move the file, plant a decoy, and let the investigator waste their time. He called Clara to his study. "The file in my desk drawer, the one with the blue tab, remove it, burn it, then place the red-tabbed file from the safe in the drawer instead." The red-tabbed file contained mundane, boring financial reports from a closed subsidiary. It was a perfect, boring decoy. Clara, nervous but obedient, nodded and left to carry out the order. What Vance didn't know was that Clara's loyalty had a crack. The sight of the frightened boy, the sheer ugliness of Crow's threat against a child, had unsettled her deeply. She was a woman who valued order, not cruelty. As she stood at the industrial shredder in the basement service room, the blue-tabbed file in her hands, she hesitated. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page. It wasn't just a script. It was a detailed dossier on the DOL investigator, complete with personal details, his daughter's school, his wife's recent job loss, notes on potential pressure points. It was a blueprint for blackmail. This crossed a line from ruthless business into something sickening. Clara didn't shred it. She carefully removed 5 key pages, the scripted interview answers and the investigator's dossier, and slipped them into the pocket of her cardigan. She shredded the rest of the file, as instructed, and placed the decoy red file in the drawer. She then left the estate, claiming a family emergency. That evening, an encrypted email arrived at Arthur Finch's private server. It contained scanned images of the 5 pages sent from an anonymous account. There was no message, just the attachments. Finch, Maria, and David pored over them in Finch's home office. The dossier was the smoking gun. It proved intent to obstruct a government investigation through intimidation. It directly linked the scheme to Vance's personal letterhead and a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Crow, handle the personal touch. Use what we have." They had him, but they had to move before Vance realized the dossier was compromised. Finch worked through the night, preparing an emergency injunction and a sworn affidavit to present to a judge at dawn, seeking a warrant to seize Vance's home office computers and safe. At 6 a.m., as the sky lightened to gray, Finch stood before a judge in her chambers. The hearing was rushed secret. He presented the note, the scanned dossier pages, the affidavit from Maria detailing the threats against her son. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, read the dossier pages slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is profoundly disturbing," she said. She signed the warrant. At 7:30 a.m., as Vance was preparing for his 10 a.m. interview, 2 unmarked cars and a van from the Attorney General's office pulled up to his mansion. Agents and forensic technicians moved up the driveway. Vance watched from his window, his calm finally breaking. He saw them carrying the warrant, heading not for the front door, but around to the service entrance, to the basement, to the shredder room. Clara had not just sent the pages, she had left a digital breadcrumb. In her email to Finch, she'd included one more crucial detail: the model and serial number of the high-security shredder, which had an internal memory buffer that stored the last 72 hours of shredded documents. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. The technicians bypassed the mansion's security and went straight to the basement. They isolated the shredder, accessed its internal memory, and began a data recovery process. In Vance's study, agents imaged his computer and opened his safe. They found the decoy file. Vance stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "You're wasting the state's time. My employee acted without my knowledge." I have nothing to hide. Down in the basement, a technician looked up from his laptop. Got it, he said quietly. The buffer had been partially overwritten, but not completely. They recovered fragmented images, the letterhead from the dossier, the words pressure points. Vance's own handwriting on a sticky note scan make him understand the cost of digging. It was enough. At 9:45 a.m., as the DOL investigator arrived at the mansion for the scheduled interview, he was met by agents from the Attorney General. They escorted him inside, not as an interviewer, but as a witness. They presented Vance with the new evidence, the recovered fragments. The smirk vanished, replaced by a blank, stunned mask. He was read his rights there, in his own pristine study, under the abstract painting that cost more than a life's labor. But as they led Alexander Vance away in handcuffs, past the gathered staff and the flashing lights of news cameras that had magically appeared, his eyes found Maria. She stood on the periphery with David and Arthur Finch, watching. He didn't look angry. He looked curious, like she was a puzzle he still couldn't solve. And then he was gone, placed into the back of a car, his empire crumbling around him. Maria breathed the cool morning air, feeling a weight lift that she had carried for months. Leo was safe. David was safe. The monster was in a cage. She turned to Finch, ready to thank him, ready to believe it was over. Arthur Finch was not smiling. He was staring at his phone, his face etched with a new, deeper worry. He showed her the screen. It was a news alert. Axiom Data Solutions stock plummets following CEO arrest. The subheadline read, Board announces fire sale of assets, major layoffs expected at Tech Vertex and subsidiaries. Finch looked at Maria, his voice grave. We won the battle. We put the dragon in chains. But when a dragon falls, it doesn't just disappear, it crashes, and thousands of innocent people are standing underneath it. Finch was right. The crash was not metaphorical. It was a wave of pink slips and shuttered factories. Within 72 hours of Alexander Vance's perp walk hitting the news, the board of Axiom Data Solutions initiated a panic fire sale. The Tech Vertex packaging plant, the one David Reyes had tried to unionize, was the first asset liquidated. Its new owners, a private equity firm, announced they were consolidating operations. In practice, that meant laying off 147 workers with 3 days' notice and no severance. The deal Vance had tried to sabotage was now dead, and the workers he had tried to silence were the ones who paid the price. David watched from the sidelines, his vindication tasting like ash. He had wanted to protect those jobs, not destroy them. Maria's personal victory felt hollow, haunted by this collateral damage. She received temporary protected status and a modest victims' compensation grant from the state, enough to secure a small, clean apartment and steady childcare for Leo. But she couldn't forget the faces of the plant workers on the local news, holding cardboard boxes, their futures uncertain. Arthur Finch counseled her that Vance's system was the disease, and its collapse, while painful, was necessary. You didn't cause this crash, Maria. You revealed the rot that made the structure unstable, he told her, but the logic was cold comfort. The legal proceedings moved with the grinding speed of high-stakes white-collar crime. Vance, out on a $10 million bail, assembled a fortress of legal defense. His strategy was exactly as predicted: pin everything on Mason Crow, the rogue operative. He claimed the dossier in the shredder was Crow's work, that he, Vance, was a distracted CEO unaware of his fixer's criminal methods. The blue-tabbed file, he never saw it. The handwritten note, Crow must have forged it. It was a flimsy story, but told confidently by a man in a $2,000 suit. It created doubt. The trial began 6 months later. Maria was the prosecution's star witness. Sitting in the witness box, under the cool gaze of the defense attorney, she recounted the humiliation, the threats, the live feed of her son. She described finding the note. When the defense attorney insinuated she was a disgruntled employee seeking a payday, Maria didn't get angry. She just looked at Alexander Vance, who sat perfectly still at the defense table, and then she looked at the jury. I just wanted to clean his floors, feed my son, and be invisible, she said, her voice clear. He is the one who made me seen. He is the one who made my 5-year-old boy a threat he needed to control. It was the most damning testimony, not of crime, but of character. The smoking gun, however, came from an unexpected source. Clara, the former house manager. Subpoenaed by the prosecution, she took the stand, her hands clasped tightly. She confirmed the existence of the fabricated personnel file against Maria. She described Vance's order to shred the blue-tabbed file, and then she offered the final, crucial piece. She testified that Vance had a specific, habitual way of annotating documents, a small red asterisk he would draw next to items requiring aggressive follow-up. The original "handle it" quietly note bore that asterisk. The dossier on the DOL investigator had the same mark. The defense argued anyone could draw an asterisk, but when combined with Clara's testimony about Vance's meticulous habits, it painted a picture of direct knowledge and command. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They found Alexander Vance guilty on 8 counts, including conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness intimidation, and fraudulent business practices. Mason Crowe, having cut a deal for a lighter sentence, testified against Vance in exchange for a reduced charge. Vance was sentenced to 7 to 10 years in a minimum security federal prison. His assets were largely seized or liquidated to pay fines and settlements. The mansion in Pacific Heights was sold at auction. In the weeks after the sentencing, Arthur Finch approached Maria with a new idea born from the wreckage. The compensation fund from Vance's seizure was substantial. A portion was earmarked for the displaced workers of the Tech Vertex plant. Finch proposed they use a segment of that fund not just for payouts, but to seed a worker-owned cooperative, a small-scale packaging business that could employ some of the laid-off workers. He asked David Reyes to help organize it. He asked Maria to sit on its advisory board, to represent the principle of dignity that had been so violently denied. Maria was hesitant. She wanted peace, not another battle. But Leo, now 6, asked her a question one night. "Mommy, is the bad man gone for good?" She said yes. "And the people who lost their jobs because of him, are they okay?" She had to say she didn't know. In that moment, she understood that justice wasn't just about putting a man in a cage. It was about trying to mend what he broke. The cooperative, named New Foundation Packaging, launched 9 months later. It started small with 15 former employees. David Reyes was its operations manager. The work was hard, the profit margins slim, but the principle was everything: fair wages, safe conditions, a voice for every worker. Maria's role was largely symbolic, but her presence at the opening ceremony, holding Leo's hand, was a powerful symbol. She was no longer the invisible cleaner. She was a founder. A year after the trial, Maria received a letter. It was forwarded through her attorney. The return address was the Federal Correctional Institution. Inside, on plain prison stationery, was a single paragraph in a precise, familiar handwriting. "Ms. Rivera, I have had ample time to reflect. Your son asked me if I was a bad man. I believe the question was childish. I now understand it was the only question that mattered. I built an empire on the principle that people were variables. He reminded me they are not. I do not ask for forgiveness. That is not the point of this. The point is that he was right." IV. Maria read it twice, then folded it and put it away. She didn't know what to feel. There was no apology, just a cold, clinical acknowledgement. It was the most honest thing Alexander Vance had ever given her. She never replied. Life moved on. Leo started first grade. Maria, with Finch's help, secured her permanent residency and enrolled in community college courses in business management. She still cleaned, but now for herself, for a small, growing list of clients who hired her not through a shady agency, but by referral. She set her own hours, her own rates, and she always brought Leo along after school, teaching him that work was not servitude. The final, surprising detail emerged 2 years later, during the routine audit of Vance's remaining, complex assets. A blind trust, established years before his arrest, was discovered. It was a modest fund, not for his own benefit, but allocated for annual donations to a charity supporting children's advocacy and domestic worker rights. The first donation had been automatically sent the year he entered prison. The charity had no idea of its source. The trust was administered by a rigid, automated system. The amount was exactly $19,000, $19 an hour for 1,000 hours of work. It was not signed. It carried no message. But Maria, when Arthur Finch told her about it, understood. It was not restitution. It was a transaction balanced to the last decimal. For the man who saw the world in numbers, it was the only form of atonement his mind could compute. The dragon was in chains. The village was rebuilding stronger on a foundation they owned. and the boy who had stepped into the path of the beast, armed only with a child's sense of right and wrong, was now a second grader who told his friends his mom was a boss. The story that began with a clenched fist in a mansion office ended not with a single victory, but with a slow, stubborn healing and the quiet understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the love that overpowers it. So what do we take from a story like this? On the surface, it's a simple drama, the powerless against the powerful, a child's bravery, a villain punished. But dig deeper, and it reveals a much more uncomfortable truth about the architecture of our everyday world. It shows us how silence is often purchased, not given, how exploitation is built into the shadows of gleaming success. Maria's story is not an anomaly. It is a reflection of a system where millions of domestic workers, often women, often immigrants, perform essential labor in the hidden corners of our economy, vulnerable to humiliation and abuse because their need is greater than their protection. Leo's intervention was a spark, but the fire that followed was built by a community, a cousin who wouldn't be silenced, a manager whose conscience cracked, a retired lawyer who remembered what justice was for. This is the real lesson. Injustice thrives on isolation. It convinces each person that they are alone, that their fear is unique, that speaking up will only make things worse. But when one person finds the courage to break that silence, it gives permission to others. It creates a chain. Clara, the manager, holding back those damning pages, was just as crucial as Maria holding the original note. David Ray's organizing his co-workers was just as vital as Arthur Finch arguing before a judge. Change is never a single hero. It is a chorus of whispers that becomes a roar. Story of Alexander Vance is a cautionary tale of a different kind. It's not about a man who was pure evil, but about a man who decided that people were variables in an equation. He believed his wealth and intellect built a world where consequences were for other people. He was wrong. The most profound judgment he faced did not come from a jury. It came from the unshakable moral clarity of a 5-year-old boy who saw his mother crying and knew in his bones that it was wrong. That is a power no amount of money can buy, and no legal defense can refute. This is why we tell these stories, to remember that the world is not divided into heroes and villains, but into choices. The choice to see the humanity in the person cleaning your home or serving your food. The choice to speak up when you witness cruelty, even if it's uncomfortable. The choice to believe someone who has less power than you, not less truth. Maria and Leo's life today is not a fairy tale ending. It is a hard-won peace. There is no mansion, but there is a home filled with security. There is no fortune, but there is dignity. And perhaps that is the most revolutionary outcome of all, a life where fear no longer sets the menu, where a child can grow up knowing his mother is safe, and where work is an act of pride, not of survival. Now I want to turn it over to you. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's dignity was being stripped away? Did you speak up, or did you look away, and what did that moment teach you? Share your story in the comments below. These conversations are how we build a more compassionate world, one story at a time. If this narrative reminded you that courage comes in all sizes and that justice often needs a helping hand, then subscribe. We are dedicated to bringing you the deeply human stories that illuminate the shadows and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Because sometimes, the smallest voice can change everything.